Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. If you'd like to join our writing community on Discord and get access to fantasy writing classes and books on Patreon, check the links in the description. And if you don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to follow or subscribe. And to support the show, leave a quick rating on Spotify or iTunes and share this episode on social media or with anyone who you think may be interested. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the show. Welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. I'm your host, Richie Burling, and today I am delighted to be joined by #1 New York Times bestseller and international bestselling author, Jennifer L. Armentrout. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, thank you very much for joining me. It's an honor to chat with you. And you've got a new book out. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Born
It
of
is,
Blood and Ash.
yes, it is coming out, I believe, it came out on August the 13th. And it is the longest book I've ever written. It's unnecessarily enormous.
God, how big is it then?
Well, this is it right here. So I don't know if you get to see it. It's I think it was I want to say it was over 300,000 words. Yeah, it's a lot.
Hey, that wasn't fun to edit.
No, my editors were probably like my editors know like when I go silent from them, like because usually like if I am encounter a plot hole as I'm writing or like something that I'm not sure about, like I'll message my editor to like, hey, do you have time to jump on this? So when I go completely quiet and they do not hear from me, they have learned that means one or two things. I am running late on the book and I'm just voiding them. Or like, yeah, I just don't want to tell them something. And so like there was several months where I was just like, I didn't reach out to the publisher at all because I was like, oh my God, because I kept going back and redoing the beginning because I was like, okay, how do I need to cut words out. Like I need to get some words out. And I was like, okay, the beginning would probably be the best part to do it. And every time I did it, I would end up adding more stuff, which is not helpful. Or like I couldn't remove it. Like this was stuff that had to be in the book. And I mean, they took it well.
Yeah.
But they were like, how many? But they really don't care so much about the word count as they do the page count. Because a lot of people don't realize this. Oh my gosh, I see your kitty. Sorry. I just saw something white moving around the black. I was like, what is happening back there? But a lot of people don't realize that how a book is published, like the format, there's only a certain amount of pages that can be put into that book before you may have a quality issue where, the binding won't stay together. So, and also, of course, the cost of making the book goes up per page. So, that's the main thing they care about is, okay, what's going to be the page count? And what really affects that is like, if you have like, say, for example, like a bunch of short chapters, it's like, you can't start the chapter on the same page. I mean, you can, but that's just not how it's been done. They want to, they have to start on another page. So, yeah, they were, they were nervous, but it wasn't as bad as we feared.
I suppose it's always a tough balance between, for you, delivering what your readers want and obviously having to appease the powers that be.
Yeah, because it's a fine line, and and the thing is, like when I first started writing, I didn't, of course, like most people, you don't know about any of this. You don't even think about the fact that there's only so many pages a trade paperback can hold before the spine breaks, or the same for hardcover, or publishers have a price range they factor into their budgets that they know that the book will cost between this amount, and that's how they determine their pricing structure, advance, if there's an advance, like everything. And you just don't realize that until, and I mean, there's probably a lot of authors who've been around for a long time that just, which is okay, just was maybe never curious about, okay, what goes on behind the scenes. But yeah, it can be hard. I wish I didn't know some of this stuff because it gets in my head as I'm writing, and I'm like, oh, I can't, like, that's one of the reasons why I had gotten behind on writing that book, is because I just kept going back. And if I hadn't really thought about that, I wouldn't have, spent 2 months trying to edit down words.
Yeah, especially that volume as well. Fair play to you. Before we dive into that book, where I always like to ask about people's sort of journeys through writing, and like how you got into it and what sort of led you down this path.
So mine, I feel like it is like pretty cliche. I guess it's not 100% cliche. So I always wanted to be a writer. And the reason being is because I loved reading. And so I grew up very, very poor. And so we didn't, like, for summer vacations, for example, that did not exist in our household. But what my mom would do is, with my brother and I, she would, during the summer, like, we would walk from our house down to the public library. So, and I don't know if your libraries are like this, but they would always have these sections where there were books that were donated to them. And usually books that are donated to a library, they can't really put them in their library system. So they
Yeah.
go into like a free area where, you can keep the books. And a lot of those books were always like romance, and especially historical romance. And I don't know if you've ever taken a gander at
Mhm.
1980s, 90s historical romance. Probably not the most appropriate thing for a 13-year-old to be reading, but I was. And so, reading became an escape. Like, it was a way for me to, like, just read about different times or different places. And finally, as I got a little bit older and discovered the young adult section, which, wasn't anywhere near the size that it is now. So I wanted to be able to do that, but I knew that, becoming a writer is like, it feels like a dream. Like, it feels like a pot dream, like where it's like
Yeah.
you're not going to whatever. So I went to college for um, completely not this, psychology and sociology with a
Nice.
criminal justice or criminology um,
That's really cool.
focus. Yeah.
Because I suppose that's so helpful when you're getting into a character's head, creating characters. That is like one of the best degrees you probably could have done.
Yeah, I tell myself that, because I had to pay off my student loans. Like, I was like, yeah, I am kind of using this, but I was always fascinated with the human mind. And so what I wanted to do was work in what they call behavioral science, which is, back in the day, I'm sure they call it something different now. It was called profiling. Now, of course, profiling is associated with not great things. But
Yeah.
back then, it was basically studying certain cases so that you could build a profile of a person who'd be more likely to do this. And so that's what I wanted to do. But, like, to do that, you usually have to be working within the FBI.
Yeah.
And then I had, back then they had a lot stricter, drug policies of your past. And so, like, I think back then it was like you couldn't smoke pot more than 3 times. You were then disqualified.
I
And
smoked
now
a
I'm
many
sure
times.
right. And I'm like, wait a minute, 3, like, why is it 3? It's like, why is 3 the magic number here?
They just look
Um,
3 strikes and you're out.
right? Yeah. It's like, okay, you smoked it 3 times, you're a pothead. We can't trust you. It's like, but so I did work in the field of psychology for a little bit, but, like, and then just one time I just started writing again because I did write when I was a teenager, and it it grew from there. But I always wanted to be a writer, but I also knew, and this is, I always tell, like, aspiring writers that, you know, you don't have to go to college for it. If you want to, you can, but you don't
Yeah.
have to go to college and major. I would suggest go to college for your secondary passion, because getting, into writing and being able to make a life off of it, a living off of it, isn't easy. And so, having that backup, but it was something I always wanted to do because I
Yeah.
loved reading so much.
And what was the big break like for you? Was it hard to break in, and did you ever feel like it was never going to happen?
Yeah, I did, because like when like so much has changed in the publishing world in the just even the last decade. So I started writing seriously probably in 2007, 2008. But I had like performance anxiety, basically. Like I wouldn't submit
Yeah.
it to anybody because then it became real. Like it was, then you're actually doing this. But during that time, keep in mind, so I think I finished the book like in 2009, and then in 2010, I, found this website called quarrytracker.net. And this is a website back then. I believe it still exists, where you could submit your queries, whatever, your first 10 pages, and people in the forum would help critique it or make changes. But keep in mind, like back then, like Twitter, I think just started. Um, the internet was nowhere near the way it is now. And so there wasn't a lot of readily available information at your fingertips, but also back then. And this would be about 2010. And so that's what, 14? No, wait a minute, I can't count. It's 14 years ago. Yes. I'm like, wait a minute. Time has no.
I can't count
Yeah.
that. So I'm not correcting you.
Yeah, I was like, time has no meaning now. But like self-publishing, for example, or even small press publishing, meaning an independent publisher that wasn't a part at that time, like the big six, was heavily frowned upon. It
Yeah.
was not a thing for the vast majority of people. And it was extremely hard to get an agent. So I had to go about it like pretty much the way everybody does. But I forget what I got, was somebody had posted advice somewhere, and they said, like, while you're out on submission with one book, start writing another book, because the first one may not be it, but the one you're working on now may be. So I kind of did that. But my first publisher was a small press publisher. And I had that deal before I signed with an agent. And then I signed with an agent after that. Um, but I did have a very unorthodox way for that time, because again, back then they were self-publishing or indie publishing with an independent publisher
Yeah.
was heavily frowned upon. But I stuck with it, and you know I I always believe the don't put your eggs all in one basket
Yeah.
mentality. Like, so, but it definitely an unorthodox way. But I'm glad now for newer writers, you have so many more options for people,
Yeah.
and viable options than we did even 14 years ago.
Yeah. It's amazing how it's all changed. One question that I wanted to ask you, just you mentioned your background, and I come from quite a similar background, and something that is a bit of a bugbear for me is imposter syndrome. I always wondered whether you suffered from that too when you were starting out.
Oh my God, I still have.
Yeah,
It
I
never
think it
goes
goes
away.
away, does it? No.
No, I mean, I'm sure for some people it does, and I envy them, but I feel like it never really goes away. And for me, I always thought before that the reason why it never went away for me is because I didn't start like everybody else. Not everybody else, but other people who were in my genre had, where, they went the extreme traditional right out the gate. And so I always thought, okay, that's why I have imposter syndrome. Um, but then I realized, yeah, that doesn't go away. It's like I think, but you know what? There's a part of me that is okay with that, because I feel like because I do feel like once you don't have imposter syndrome and you're like, okay, I've made it. I feel like, yeah, you're going to jinx yourself, number
Yeah.
one.
Then you thought
And
it keeps driving you on, doesn't it?
yeah, yeah. And I think that like once you think you've made it, you start to believe your own hype. And the moment you believe your own hype, it it's shit at that point. Like I feel like
Yeah.
we probably all somebody, have read something or watched a TV show where we're like, oh yeah, like where you can tell when someone's in love with their writing, not so much in love with the story they're telling, kind of
Yeah.
vibe. But like, so I feel like having imposter syndrome keeps you from that happening. So at least there's a positive spin.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us all about Born of Blood and Ash. It's the last book in the series. Was it a bit of an emotional one writing?
Yeah, I think any last book in a series is always like bittersweet. I mean, at least for me, there's always a point in writing every book where I'm so done with it. And I just want to kill all the characters and just, announce new characters halfway through and be like, spoiler, everybody's dead. Here's the new characters. But you do like when you work as with book, in that world for so long, they do almost become real to you for a while. And it's even, but it's not so much that case with this book because this series is the prequel to the main series, The Blood and Ash, and the characters that you see in the Flesh and Fire series, you will see again in Blood and Ash. So I don't. It's not like I'm saying goodbye to them yet,
Yeah.
um, but that does make it more complicated because you have two timelines basically that you have to keep straight that is in almost the same world in a way. And it makes it a little bit more complicated, but it is the final book for this series. And what it's basically doing is in the Blood and Ash world, you learn that there are gods that the people in the kingdom worship. And I knew that there was like this story behind a lot of what was told about the gods weren't true. Like basically what happens in history to us, right? Where you have all these versions told over so many years, you really no longer know what is the truth, but there may be a kernel of truth in it. And when I was like, I think it was like book two or no, book two or three of from the Blood and Ash series, I was like, I was having to kind of summarize it in that book. And then I realized, okay, wait a minute. Instead of me summarizing it, like I should maybe tell how this happened. And that's where the Flesh and Fire series came from. So you basically are in that series, you're learning about what some of the things that happened that made the world that you see in Blood and Ash the way that it is. And so that's where the idea came from. So you get also, there's a lot of questions from both series that they finally get answered in this series. So you don't have to read the Blood and Ash series. This can be read ahead of that. It probably is beneficial to you to do that. But it's really kind of paves the way for the next book in the Blood and Ash series too.
Nice. I like the continuity there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? Just like playing around with the series. Are they different time periods or are these sort of all quite close together?
No, it's so funny. I always have readers, they want to know the exact amount of years down to probably the month. And I
Yeah.
refuse to say it. And the only reason why is because I will forget what I said.
Yeah.
And they will be somebody who is much smarter than me, who's going to sit down, read these books, and actually figure out the year, the month, the day, and the time difference. And it'll be completely incorrect from what I said. So I always give like this range, but I always say it's several hundred to 1,000 years.
Oh,
And
nice.
because
Yeah.
I kind of looked at like in our history of like you look at like for example the Roman Empire, right? Like how advanced that was compared to everything that came after that, and how many years had to pass before society started to once again start doing what was done in the empire then. So that was kind of how I imagined it would have to be that amount of years would have to pass.
Nice.
But it's good in a way because it keeps the actual timelines different enough that I don't get them confused. But it's like I have to remember when I'm in the Blood and Ash world, there's certain things that those characters wouldn't know. Um, so it can get a little
Yeah.
complicated in that way.
Yeah. I suppose it's nice to plant a few seeds as well for the
Yeah.
next series all that time. Nice. But did you have a favorite part of this book without giving any spoilers away?
Yeah, there are a couple of scenes that I knew that I would always write. And I knew this when I wrote the second or third book in Blood and Ash. Like there's a scene in the third book of the Blood and Ash series that you finally, something is mentioned and you actually finally see it, what they're referencing. And so I always knew that was coming. I was excited to write that. There is also some stuff that happens in this book that I wouldn't say, because it's gonna make me sound demented if I said it was my favorite scene, but I feel like they are because they're powerful in a way that anybody who has a lot of power, they're not going to be, they're not going to always be good, and they're not going to always be able to make the right decision. It doesn't mean that they're bad, but that doesn't mean that, like, basically it's kind of showing, I've always believed this, like no one should have ultimate power. Like it's going, like that saying, it will corrupt at some point. And or you will, in your anger, do something that is just as terrible as what you're angry with. And so there's some, I knew that I was going to finally get to that point in the series where you can understand how the people, how they decided that they should not have, like, they should have, I'm trying to describe this without spoilers. Just so but basically you see why certain decisions were made about who has absolute power, because nobody, I don't feel like, can truly wield that appropriately. Something's going to happen. And they were hard scenes to write, because I feel like one thing a lot of books do, whether they're fantasy, right? Whether they're dealing with aliens or vampires or gods, they kind of mirror real life things that happen. And where it's like one of the themes in this book and in this series is, at what point does anger turn to vengeance? And once it becomes that, are you any better than what you are fighting against? And knowing that I was finally getting to that point in writing it was my favorite part to write, but it was also the hardest, because I feel like you can look to the world and see examples of that where there's no good people here, like in this situation. And I think it makes even fantasy books just so realistic, because again, I feel like you can look to outside and see examples of this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And do you think people can relate to these issues more when they're told in a story format than sort of just delivered on news channels?
I do. I 100, because I feel like it's the same reason why comedians can say things that you're like, what? Wait, what? That if
Yeah.
you heard said anyplace else, that you wouldn't want to listen to it. But if it can get you to laugh at the same, and then it's like you don't realize that, yeah, they're telling you something and you're laughing. And then hopefully, once you think about it, you start to realize. I think it's the same reason, because it doesn't feel like it's being shoved down your throat. It doesn't feel like someone is, on a moral high ground trying to
Yeah.
tell you, well, you're wrong or they're wrong. You're able to actually kind of watch it without feeling judged or confused or whatever. You can read it. And I do think, I mean, there's been examples that I can even think of in my older books where certain things would happen. And it's like people would, you could see that it would be heavily close to like immigration, where if you have a problem with aliens being rounded up, but you don't have a problem with people in real life having that same thing done to them.
Yeah.
Like where, it can make you sometimes stop and think, right? Like, and when I say aliens, I mean aliens from space, like not an immigrant. But yeah, so I do think it makes it easier for people, because also I think we forget, because of the internet, that people live in these very small enclaves where they don't have the same experience as another person. They don't have the ability to meet different people, or experience different lives. And I think when through reading, it does sometimes expose people to different cultures, different beliefs, different backgrounds. And people do learn that way, especially when you get into the more contemporary side of books, but even in the
Yeah.
fantasy.
Do you feel like it's important to include them kind of things in your stories?
I mean, I think for me personally, it's not something I go in intentionally writing. Like, I don't go in like, I'm going to try to sneak a message in here, underneath
Yeah,
people's nose. But I think like when you deal with a fantasy book, for example, there's only so many ways fantasy books are written, right? Like they kind of have almost the same overarching plot of there's sometimes kingdoms, there's the good people, there's the bad people. Um, and I feel like for me, and like many other fantasy writers, you actually look at history to kind
yeah,
of shape how you tell it. And by doing that, then you end up, because history does repeat itself, it seems like. Even if we know
yeah,
better, history will repeat, it seems to repeat itself. That you sometimes do find things mirroring what's happening in the world around you. And it's not always intentional. Um, but I do think it does make it more realistic because you can see, like, again, you could be dealing with any type of, you know, being that doesn't exist in the real world, but they're facing the same problems.
yeah. I love it. I just think it's so liberating to take what we see in our world and shape it in unique ways, in ways that people can relate to probably a lot more than they see it. And like, I suppose through the culture, sometimes we have to. That's how we reach people is through like cultural mediums, songs. Like Bob Dylan, for example, like the amount of messages he passed on through his songs, and I don't know. I think it's brilliant that you're doing it, and I think a lot more writers should consider not
Yeah,
obviously shoving it down your throat, but if it's there and the opportunity
yeah.
is there.
And again, I think that like I feel like if with certain books, especially fantasy, I just don't even see how that you couldn't find that in those books, right? Like I feel like
Yeah,
you're going to find it because most of them are inspired by even ones that have like the fae running around or dragons. They have things that are happening in there that happened in our, in our history. And so I feel like you just have that in there, whether or not the author realizes they're doing it. Um, but again, I feel like the thing for me with important is fantasy. When I'm reading it, I still want to believe it. Like when
yeah,
I'm reading it, I gotta believe it. Like you can tell me any line of bullshit. I just gotta believe it, right? I have to
yeah,
believe the story. And like I think one of the ways you do that is when you're able to relate to that. Like you're able to relate to certain events, not just the characters, but certain events that are happening. Once you're able to relate to all of that, it becomes so much more real to you as the reader. And I think that's when you do start to get readers really invested in the world itself and not just the characters.
yeah. I think let's stick with the world building side because it's a massive topic in the world of fantasy, isn't it? Probably the
Mhm.
most distinguishing feature. Um, so your world's very sort of highly spoken of. How do you approach the creation process?
Um, you know, strangely, I have written in every genre up to this point. Like everything is set for like religious or inspirational or historical. I had written in a lot of genres, and I always wanted to write in fantasy, but I was very intimidated by it because you have you don't have like because in every other novel, most of them the world already exists. You don't have to explain to people like how communication happens or like you don't have to explain or acknowledge the building, right? Because you can just say a skyscraper
Yeah,
and throw some adjectives in there and people know what you're talking about. In fantasy, you then have to research what could they build this building of if they didn't have this, and then 5 hours later you're pretty confident you could build a freaking building. So like you have to, the world becomes a character in a way. Like it becomes its own living, breathing thing. And I feel like that is what took me the longest. I actually got the idea for Blood and Ash while watching the 2016 Olympics.
nice.
It has literally nothing to do with the Olympics at all. I don't know why. The idea I was watching probably the gymnastics portion of it, And I just started, I've always been a huge fan of Greek mythology. So I'm just going to say it was that, like the Greek aspect of it. But it literally took me from 2016 to 2019 of fleshing out the world, because I was so nervous, because again, I never wrote a fantasy or high fantasy, I guess is what they would call it. And it just, I felt like I had to take my time and I had to really flesh out this world. Um, but yeah, I think it's as important as the characters, because again, the world can have dragons, it can have witches, it can have vampires, it can have shifters, it can have whatever. It has to be believable. And when you write fantasy, you have to create rules, and then you have to stick to those rules that you've created.
Yeah.
So it takes, I feel like it's a lot building that world.
Is that one of the key things you think to making it believable, is the creation of the rules and sticking to them?
Yeah, I think the having like guidelines, right? Like that, because we have certain things we know we can't do in our world. And having that makes it okay. This isn't just a magical world. But I do think what makes it more believable is the characters, and also like what is the part of that world, like society, things like that. Um, I think that's what makes it more believable to people, is because they can still like see themselves in that character, as that character in that world, and the world makes sense to them.
Yeah. Nice. Excellent world building tips. I think that's one of the best I've ever heard, though, is to treat the world like a character. I think that's
Yeah,
really good. Yeah, because
yeah. I
obviously
mean,
the world changes like a character would.
yep, yep. And
So
I feel like with fantasy, I feel like you have to, because again, you don't have the actual real world to lean back on. And it almost it has to come off the page, like that world. People have to be able to picture it, because when you are writing a contemporary, you can, like I said, you can say a skyscraper, people know what you're talking about. If you're a person who visualizes what you're reading, they're able to do that. But in fantasy, you really have to find out ways to describe things in a way that isn't obvious what you're doing,
yeah.
and so that people can visualize the story as they're reading.
What would you do? Would you like pick out certain details that give you enough to form the image, or would you go into quite a lot of detail about things?
I would go into enough detail. So basically, when I'm writing, I have to be able to see it in my head. It has to play like a movie or a TV show in my head. Like,
Yeah.
and if I can't, that means something's wrong with what I'm writing. So if I'm writing it and I can see it as I'm writing it, then I know I've given it enough detail. I try not to harp on the detail. Like I don't want like an entire paragraph that's just explaining a forest, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Unless there's something important about that forest. Like, um, but I feel like if I'm writing it and I'm seeing it, then I've got the detail. But I
Yeah.
do feel like that's different for every writer. Um, but I feel like as you, the writer, you have to be able to at least visualize it to some extent. But I do
Yeah.
understand some people, which we all learned on the internet not too many years ago, that some people don't see what they read. So,
Yeah.
which is, I'm one of those people who do, and I never knew that there was people that didn't. So I
Yeah.
don't know about you.
Yeah. No, I'm same as you. And
Yeah.
I think there's another thing recently about people who have a sort of running monologue in their head, and some people don't
Oh
have
yeah.
that even.
I'm like,
I was like, oh
but
my
the
god,
thing is, I don't
I
think they
can't imagine what
understand.
it'd be like to just be quiet.
But no, because you ask them, I don't think they understand what an inner monologue is. Because when you ask them, then what do you hear? And they're like, my thoughts. And I'm like, what do you think an inner monologue is? It's your thoughts.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
so I guess
Confused.
what they may be thinking is that their thoughts don't have a voice, that they, you know what I mean? It doesn't have a voice. But I'm like, I don't think ours has a voice. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We just,
Might
I
just
think
be
it's
empty.
great. Yeah. Like,
But with
there's just not.
seeing the riots in this country at the minute, you makes you wonder.
Yeah, well, yeah. So maybe that is the case. There is a part of me sometimes that thinks, man, it would be like kind of amazing just for a day
Yeah.
if my head was completely silent. It's like just, but I feel like that leads to other problems down the
Yeah.
road.
I don't think I'd
But
enjoy it. I'd be scared.
yeah. I feel like the silence, that's one thing. In this book, the character Serafina, it was really important to me to have, like, even though she becomes a very powerful person, to have that this character has struggles that we can identify with, and so she has anxiety,
Yeah.
um, really bad, and for her, like, when her head's quiet is when it's the worst.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
when she's not focused on something, not doing something, and when her head goes quiet, then that's when, it's like, if anybody's had anxiety, that's when you start paying attention to the stupidest things. Like, you start noticing your heart rate,
Yeah.
and then you start noticing your breathing. And if you're like me, then you're like, well, why? How do I breathe? Like, you start falling down these weird mental rabbit holes. And with her, the silence is the worst. It's because that allows you to really think about things you don't necessarily want to think about.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I don't think, now that I think about it, probably having a quiet mind doesn't stay that way for very long.
Yeah. Just sticking on characters, obviously writing a series, the characters play a huge role in keeping readers with the books. So, how do you approach the creation of your characters?
I think for me, it's like anytime I start a book, there will be usually two characters that will immediately come to mind. And I know who they are in my head, like what their purpose is, what some of their journey will be. And then for me, how I write, like I have that basic foundation that, like, with Serafina, she is someone who was supposed to save her kingdom but failed, even though it really wasn't something she had control over it. Um, and so I knew that she had like this guilt, and kind of felt like people, always thought about this when they saw her, and she was also knew that she wouldn't be known to many people because it was kind of like she was hidden away as this failure. And I knew that as I was starting to write it. But then with characters, I have learned that no matter what you may intend their journey to be, sometimes the story changes. Like as you're writing it, the story sometimes can go into other directions that then changes how the character's development is going to be. But I always have a general idea of like one to two characters. And then once I start writing, like the secondary characters and other main characters start to come up from what I'm writing.
Yeah, it's amazing how they do shape stories, isn't it? And you're going through and then you realize, oh, this doesn't work at all.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, I want to say that I have learned to let it go. Like when it happens, like, just let it go because this story's telling you that what you originally planned no longer works. I'm here to tell you I've written, I think, 70 books. I have not
Nice.
learned this.
That's the
I
process.
still fight it.
What was your favorite genre? You've written so many. I know you're probably most well known for the romance the last few years, but what is your favorite genre?
I think my favorite genre is probably the fantasy and paranormal genres because they are a true escape. Like, especially fantasy. It's true escapism. And
Yeah,
I know a lot of readers read those for that reason. But it also, I think, we as authors, we forget that it also gives us that same thing where it's escapism. And I think it's just something, and I think part of it too, again, is I was always, always obsessed with like Greek mythology, Norse mythology, things like that.
yeah,
And it's, and fantasy just really reminds me of that, of like these stories that people at one time really believed. And, and then again, like with the way my head works, I feel like a lot of writers, we just, then we always, we say something normal, but our thought doesn't end there. Like, then we're like, "Okay, but what if they were real?" And like, and so, and I feel like that's why, my love for mythology grew into the love of the paranormal and fantasy, because again, you see a lot of those roots in that. in different mythologies throughout the entire world. You can see a lot of the fantasies and even science fiction come from a lot of that.
And do you particularly enjoy a young adult audience? Is that your sort of target audience, do you think?
Not for these books. So these books are definitely adult. But I do, there are younger readers who read them. And when I wrote young adult, honestly, like they have like these age guidelines, but really as a reader, you know what you're ready for as a reader
Yeah.
typically. Because when I do write young adults and I go to like young adult events, like you can tell like readers who are like the middle teenage years, like 15, 16. One of them is going to seem so much older than the one standing next to them.
Yeah.
And so I feel like readers, they know what they're ready for. But like, for example, if any of these books ended up in a young adult library section, I'd be like, oh my God, this may not be great for them. But I started off writing young adult. So it's always like, you know, um, I feel like I haven't written a young adult book in a while, but I feel like I don't want to say it's like going home because that
Yeah.
sounds cheesy, but it's like, okay, that's how I got started, was writing young adult, and I want to write it again. But and I think with young adult, the reason why I think people like to write it and readers love to read it is because no matter what type of genre you're writing in, you have people experiencing their firsts of everything, like first loss, first heartache, first love, first lust, first whatever. And I feel like that is something people, even if it's sad, they sometimes want to relive, like what it felt like before
Yeah.
you experience certain things.
Let me get that first once.
Yeah.
Awesome. I've got one more question for you, Jennifer. Uh, what is the most important or the best piece of advice you've got for any writers, aspiring writers out there?
I think the best advice that I could give is, and this is something that other people have said, and that's how I heard it. And it's going to sound so simple, is write what you like to read. And again, people are listening to this, we're like, well, no shit. However, that you forget that. And especially as you progress in your writing career, you're going to feel pressure, whether you're with a publisher or not. You're going to see what's selling and you're going to see what everybody's talking about. You're going to see what's trending out there. And sometimes, if you're with a publisher or an agent, they will say, hey, have you ever thought about writing XYZ? That's what everybody wants right now. And or even without a publisher, you can look at and see like what's ranked in the top 100 of Amazon. And I need to be writing this, which is fine if that is something you genuinely want to write. And if you find yourself writing in a genre that you do not read, it's not going to end well for you. And because what's going to either happen is you're going to end up hating writing and you're going to hate the process. And it may not even be good because you don't know the genre and you're not happy writing.
Yeah.
And I feel like at some point in a lot of authors, I was there where a publisher wanted me to write something that I was like, I don't know, like it's just not my thing. And because I don't write like what I would call serious contemporary, like where it's more of a literary kind of
Yeah.
vibe to it. It's not my thing. But like my publisher really, really was pushing for it and I did it, but like it was it was it was so hard. I mean, it was to the point where like I was like, I don't even know why I'm doing this right now. Like, and I feel like you do run the risk of getting real burnout. Like because and again, I feel like we all some point find ourselves there. And I don't know where I saw that somebody saying it where they said, read what you want to write. And it was something that I had to remind myself that even if what I'm writing right now isn't what's trending, it doesn't matter because trends always go in a circle.
Yeah.
And there are always going to be readers there reading what you're writing. And I think it's something we forget. So it's the best. Sounds super simple, but it's something we forget, like as your career goes on.
No, that's a brilliant piece of advice. Oh, well, Jennifer, thank you very much again for giving up time out your very busy schedule to chat with me. I know a lot of people listening are going to find this a very useful and insightful chat. So thank you. And congratulations again on the book. I have no doubt it's going to be another roaring success. And everyone listening at home, go out and buy a coffee to make sure that happens. The link's in the description. Jennifer, where's the best place to find out a bit more about you and to maybe stay in touch? And have you got a newsletter and stuff people can subscribe to?
Yes, if you go to my website, it's jenniferarmentrout.com. You can sign up for the newsletter there. Usually I'm on Instagram, and that's pretty much really, other than a reader group on Facebook, I'm not really on any other social media site. I feel like I've passed the age of learning
I'm with
how
you
to
there.
use those appropriately. So, but yeah, if you go to my website, you can find links to where you can actually interact with me and sign up for the newsletter.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much again. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you everyone at home for listening.